Good morning, class 6. Here is Kaushalya Rajpurohit, your English teacher, and today we will be discussing chapter Just Before Recess. This chapter is written by James Van Pelt. He is an American science fiction author and a language teacher in Colorado. His short story collection, Strangers and Beggars, was named the best book for young adults by American Library Association. The chapter Just Before Recess is a story of a boy named Parker, right, who finds a small sun inside his desk. So, what will happen if you find a sun in your desk? Will you tell your friends or you will be hiding? Let us see what Parker did when he found a sun in his desk. Parker kept a sun in his desk. He fed it gravels and twigs and once his gum when he lost its flavor, right? So Parker has a sun in his desk and he used to feed him with gravels, small sticks and sometimes also gum. The warm varnished desktop felt good against his forearms and the desk's toasty metal bottom kept the chills off his legs, right? So the desk was warm and it kept Parker warm. Today, Mr. Earl was grading papers at the front of the class every once in a while, glancing up at the third graders to make sure none of them talking or passing notes or looking out of windows, right? So Mr. Earl was checking papers today and he was looking at the naughty childs whether they were talking or passing notes or looking out of the window. Parker would quickly shift his gaze down to his textbook so Mr. Earl would not give him the glare, a sure sign that Parker's name would soon go up on the board with others kids who had lost their lunch privilege, right? So he was keeping his head down, looking at his textbook so he doesn't get his name on the board and he will be losing his right to lunch, right, of the day. Parker took a pebble out of his pocket and put it side in the desk. Parker carefully lifted his desktop a quarter of an inch and slipped the rock in. It made a tiny click and soon the pebble was swallowed by the sun. It was 2 days ago when Parker has opened his desk to put his lunch in, but instead of pencil box, tissue box and books, he was expecting, he saw a cloud swirled in the space, right? It was spinning, it was moving in the space. At its center was a dull pulsing red glow. So there was a blinking red glow at the center. He shut the desk and looked around to see if anyone else had noticed, right? So he shut and saw that anyone else has noticed. An hour later, a dusty swirl in the dust has contracted to a bright spot in the middle, right? After an hour later, it contracted into a middle spot, a middle spear. He consciously moved his hand towards it, right? So he moved his hand to see what it is. At first he felt only heat, but when he got into few inches, the skin of his palm began to sting like a flesh was pulling away, right? So when he kept his finger for closer, it was burned. Then he took a pencil, right? And he tried with a pencil. When the point moved close enough, the pencil tugged towards the sun. The sun attracted the pencil. It then snapped out of his finger into the tiny little brightening it slightly in the process, right? So it just fell down into the desk and there was a process. The ball grew larger. The sun was large as a golf ball now. When the Parker rolled a marble across his desk, its path would curve towards the sun, within some time circling several times before resting exactly above, right? So this marble was circling around the sun. Parker, Mr. Earl said, your reading group is waiting for you in the back of the class. His 3 reading partners sat on the mats, their books on their laps. Parker pushed away from his desk and joined them, right? So he was asked to join his reading group by Mr. Earl. "Where is your book?" Mr. Earl said, his eyebrows contracting into a single line above his eyes, right? So Parker didn't have book, so Mr. Earl was scolding him. Parker shrugged. He just moved his shoulder as if he didn't know anything. Mr. Earl growled. He said angrily, "You need to be more responsible, young man. Go get your book." The other students looked on relieved that Mr. Earl's attention was on Parker and not on them, right? So the students were relieved because Mr. Earl was scolding Parker. "I don't have it, sir," said Parker, and the Parker said that he didn't have the book. It had disappeared into the sun along with everything else, and hence the Parker has to tell about the sun to Mr. Earl because he was scolding him. He told him that it has disappeared. Mr. Earl's hand clenched slightly. He pressed his hand together. Parker cringed as his teacher pushed away his desk, and he just pushed away his desk and stood up. Mr. Earl almost never left his desk. Students came to him. He did not go to the student unless infraction was terribly bad, right? So Mr. Earl never left his desk unless there was any big breaking of rule by any student. "You, young man, are irresponsible. Remember our talk about responsibility on the first day of the school?" He looked at each of the students, who nodded in turn. "Isn't your book in your desk where it belongs?" So he just asked this Parker that where was his book? Was it not into the desk? "Of course it is. That is where your books should be. Always," right? So he said that the book should be inside the desk and it is there. Everything in its place. A place for everything. Isn't that right? His question sounded like accusation. So he was accusing Parker, right? He said that the book is in the desk and he is lying. Parker nodded, "But my book isn't there, Mr. Earl," right? So he said that his book was not there. The teacher took 2 long strides and stood beside Parker's desk. Now the teacher was very angry, right? Parker was not listening to him. He said he didn't have his book. He nodded, right? "I should be careful, but the book is not there." Then Mr. Earl took long steps and stood beside Parker's desk. Before the boy could speak, Mr. Earl threw the desk open, right? So before he could speak anything, the desk was opened by Mr. Earl. For a second, he stared into it, and when he opened, there was a sun. He just stared. A white glow reflected off his face. "What is this?" he said as he reached towards the brightness, right? So he asked, "What was that?" "Careful, Mr. Earl." Parker started to stay, but it was too late. He asked Mr. Earl to be careful. The teacher screeched before lurching against the desk. He went down quickly, his feet vanishing into the desk glass, right? So the sun has also attracted Mr. Earl and he was inside the desk, his feet vanishing into the desk glass. A long silence filled the room. Parker stood up and walked back to his desk, right? So everyone was silent. It has happened something magical, right? The sun has absorbed the teacher, Mr. Earl. The sun within had grown, its heat baking like a tiny oven, and now the sun has grown bigger. He closed the top, which snapped down hard on its own at the last moment, and the Parker closed the door, right? The other student hadn't moved. Everyone was amazed. Everyone was looking at Parker. Parker looked at them. They looked at him. Over the intercom, a bell softly chimed, and at that time, the bell rang on the speaker, right? "Recess," said Parker, and they all ran outside to play, and they ran outside to play. So this is what happened just before the recess. So this is an imaginary story written by writer James Van Pelt. I hope you love the story. Thank you.